Hey there fellow crafters, it's going to be a third entry in the series of Explained with Clay, and this time we are going to talk about tank, ammunition and armor. As you can see, I have prepared several pieces of armor replicas, so to say, and also 3 pieces of ammunition. Of course, it's not going to include everything you can know about tanks and tanks history, but it's going to cover the basics of most widespread ammunition physics, how they work, what they do, etc. And also we will talk about the most common types and facts about armor you need to know if you are enthusiastic about this subject, as I am. So let's get into it, first by reviewing this ammunition replicas. Of course, they are not life-sized, but I have prepared 3 of them. As you can see, they are very different in their shapes, only the casing is the same. These are 3 different types of ammunition. Of course, there are many different nations which produce widespread sizes of them, like thickness, length, type. Also, there are other types of ammunition and how they work, but these are 3 basic ones. So let's talk about them right now. So let's start talking about the most unusual looking one. This is APFSD-S replica, translating into armor piercing, fin stabilized discarding sable. So what it in shortly also is called is Kinetic penetrator. The reasoning behind that is that this projectile doesn't need explosives in order to penetrate the armor. Of course, it has explosives in here, so the tank can fire it, but the thing that leaves the barrel is only this part. And the dangerous part in all this construction is this small, tiny black guy, which in actuality goes all the way through the casing as well, resembling to some kind of a crossbow dart, which is very dense material. Sometimes it is depleted uranium, which makes it very heavy and dense, because it can reach speeds up to 5 times speed of sound. It can go through armor like a liquid. So how this guy works is that once fired, the case of course stays inside the tank, unlike in some cheap movies where you see not only tank bullets, projectiles, but actual bullets flying with their casings as if it is in real life. Very ignorant, of course. Casing stays inside the tank. The only part which leaves is this guy, of course attached to the tail as well. So what this gray piece does, it kind of fills the whole barrel once fired, so the explosion pushes the whole dart. So the maximum amount of energy is translated into this piece. Once it leaves the barrel, then this gray piece just splits into 4 pieces, and due to air resistance just like leaves the dart, and dart goes alone, reaching 5 times speed of sound and giving a very bad day to anything it hits. Another quite unusual looking replica is a heat ammunition replica, which means high explosive anti-tank. How this guy works, same as with previous projectiles. Once fired, this black part leaves the barrel, and once hitting the target, this small protrusion, a rod which acts like a detonator, once hit, makes the main explosive to explode at this position. Inside the frontal part there is cone-shaped liner all around the shell, and this explosion melts this liner and creates a stream of molten metal which has very high temperature and can go through solid steel armor like a butter. And the last piece is a replica of most usual looking projectile replica. Is a reconstruction of HESH ammunition, which is high explosive squash head. but it can also represent simple HE, like high explosive ammunition, which means that everything inside this cone is explosives. It has lesser penetration, of course, but can deal a lot of damage to lightly armored targets. But in the example of HESH ammunition, it deals damage very, very strangely. Unlike these two guys, it do not really needs to go through their armor in order to be deadly. And we right now will be demonstrating all these three guys' effects on armor pieces. So the penetrator rod of APFSDS ammunition is very effective if the target is close by, because as further the distance the rod goes, the speed of it decreases, which means the penetrative power also gets lower and lower. So how this works is that this sheer speed makes the rod go through the armor like that, which means that once it is through the armor, it can damage inside parts of the tank. HE, on the other hand, doesn't really depend, its penetrative power doesn't really depend on the distance, because it hits, it detonates, and everything is done locally. The speed is not that important. But the penetration happens pretty much the same way, but this time it's done by not the sheer speed, but by the temperature, like a simple stream of molten metal going through the target. That's it, like that. If the molten metal hits ammunition inside the tank, it can be devastating. Of course, you can imagine what will happen to the crew members if it happens to hit them. So now let's talk about HESH ammunition. It acts very differently to previous two. So once it hits the target, the explosion created by it can deform the outer portion of the armor. So what this deformation creates is that it pushes material inside, and I have painted the inside part with layers of white paint in order to replicate what I want to talk about. Because if I have done it without paint, you won't see the cracks which can emerge if the outer portion is deformed like this after the explosion. As you can see, the inside stretches, creates these tiny cracks. And if you can imagine, with the very high speed of the bullet projectile hitting the target and exploding, this immense and instant deformation makes these tiny cracks to lob off the armor and go inside departments, like shrapnel, damaging and bouncing around inside portion of a tank. As you can see, the effect and the mechanics of all these three particular guys, their penetrating power, distance, and the overall construction of how they do their work is so different that the measures which can be taken against them can be very different and versatile as well. For these two, as you can imagine, it is very important the distance between the target and their explosion. There is some kind of barrier, not even a solid material, but simple air, which can cool down the stream of liquid metal, or dissolve the exploding powers of explosion of the main charge. It can really diminish the effect upon the armor. For these casings, we often see these cage-like constructions around vehicles, oftentimes on the sides and rear. The reasoning is very simple. On the sides and rear parts, modern tanks or AFVs do not really have a luxury to armor those parts very heavily. So they go to the assumption that these very light cages can be quite resistant against very widely spread high explosive anti-tank ammunitions. What it does is that the detonator do not really hit the main armor. It hits the outer part of the cage, it detonates here, then right now it has to go this part of more distance, which can really cool down the stream's temperature and diminish the power of which it can go through the armor. The same happens with, of course, the exploding powers. If it detonates right here, this distance allows the energy to go somewhere else instead of concentrating around the main armor part. But as you can imagine, it's not very effective against the kinetic energy penetrators. For this instance, we can take a look on another type of, so to say, additional armoring, which can be seen inside Leopard 2 turrets, which have this kind of cone wedge shapes, and these pieces in front of main armor are often hollow. So what it does is that if unlike these two, of course you can imagine that this type of armor is effective against these two guys as well. But if the penetrator penetrates this part, it has some distance to travel, during which the sheer thickness, the density of the outer part of an armor can damage the tip, guide it, of course, make it go a little bit on an angle, and just diminish its strength constructively. So the piece hitting the main armor is not as rigid, as high speed, and as deadly as it was before hitting the outer shell. So this kind of space armor can be also very effective against kinetic penetrators as well. Very widespread technology of fighting against projectiles is reactive armor. Often you can see this type of reactive armor additions on Russian and Soviet tanks due to the fact that they had quite a lot of them in stock, and once the technology came in, they decided to instead of changing the overall construction of a tank, they created this quite small, oftentimes wider and in other shaped brick type of metallic pieces, which can be attached outside the main armor thickness. And what it does is that if any kind of projectile hits it, there is inside there part of an explosive, and once hit, it explodes. Of course, the explosion is not as devastating against the armor, but the sheer force of it can hit incoming force, like diminishing the effect of molten steel, molten metal, diminishing the concentrative effect of HE ammunitions, at the same time decreasing the effects of rods as well. This type of armor is very widespread nowadays, as well as very rich and secret composition of composite armors. What it means that nowadays modern vehicles do not really have one basic material for their armor like older tanks like Tigers had of sheer homogeneous steel. Nowadays we can see ceramic layers and other types of very dense or different quality materials which can stand against different types of explosives. Last but not least thing I want to talk about is the thickness of an armor and the effective thickness. As you can see, I have a very basic armor piece, and if situated like this, you can see that the projectile needs to cover this distance in order to penetrate it, like the horizontal line onto this frontal and backward part, right? But at the same time, with less thickness, we can achieve the same distance if we angle the armor like this. If you can imagine, if the projectile comes with the same angle, it has to go through this more like slanted angle, which means that there is more material between the projectile and the inside part of an armored fighting vehicle than the simple cross section here. So this effect really helped many of World War II tanks and fighting vehicles by making it angular. It was quite easier to, with much less thickness, create quite resistant armored pieces. So yeah, that was it. Hope you enjoyed this short segment of Explained with Clay, and now you know more about tanks, armor and projectiles. If you have other interesting facts to add on or challenge my facts and opinions, you can do it down below in the comment section. Also in the description I have added some more sources to YouTubers which are far more knowledgeable about this type of things than me. That was it. Have a nice day and see you next time. Goodbye.